So we'd like to move on to the next talk by from Oxford, the Charles Spence. Of course, he's known as a very huge number of publications, mainly on the multisensory processing of the human vision. And today he presents the Gastrophysics, the multisensory science of eating.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning and to tell you about some of the research on the gastrophysics. But before that, kind of in line with the themes of the conference, a little on the Shitsukan, which I sort of had to look up myself to find out exactly quite what it meant. It wasn't a term that was familiar to me. But I think it was mentioned already, Professor Komatsu has a nice paper from earlier this year on the neural mechanisms of material perception. And this led me to think I was in safe ground. He describes it as the mechanisms of material perception, and my ears picked up when he talks about the material perception is based not just on visual stimuli, but also on tactile and or auditory sensations as well. So as a multisensory scientist, this becomes of interest. And to see how that multisensory perception of materials is then detected by sensory systems represented neurally, evaluated cognitively, emotionally, and then leads to action thereafter. So all the senses are seemingly involved, and yet in the detail of the review, it feels like most of the research on Shitsukan is visual in nature. And that really the idea of auditory material properties or tactile or even olfactory or gustatory material properties aren't really dealt with as yet. Perhaps because there has not been so much material. But to myself, from a quarter of a century of thinking about material perception, I guess I come much more from the tactile side, and that maybe ultimately it is the feel that one needs to sort of ground perception and really determine material property. That seeing isn't enough, you really want to put your finger in there and check the presence of the wounds. That touch is kind of the ultimate arbiter of the truth of maybe material quality. Something that perhaps not quite right, but was suggested all those years ago by Bishop Berkeley, when he suggests that visible figures are the marks of tangible figures that you hold, and it is plain that in themselves they are little regarded upon any score than for their connection with tangible figures, which by nature they are ordained to signify. So touch is kind of key here. Touch is fundamental in terms of educating the other senses. And one might think about what role that has then in terms of thinking about truly multisensory material perception. And I just want to go through some of the research that we've been doing, thinking about how the other senses can affect your visual impression of materials, so the influence of the senses on material perception, and then bring in sort of the gastrophysics angle by thinking about how material perception can then influence our perception of other qualities, such as the taste or flavor, sweetness or mouthfeel of food and drink. And think about some of the ways in which the artists and designers are increasingly working with the sensory scientists, the psychophysicists, and the neuroscientists to deliver engaging new kind of experiences around a multisensory material. But for me, I said I kind of come from a background in touch and always try to big up touch, as it were, as more important than perhaps we give it credit for. At least it wins out in terms of the size of the senses, touch being the biggest of our senses, accounting for about 18% of body mass, and one that we've been looking at a lot in terms of research funded around material perception of clothing and of fabrics. This a topic that has a long history, at least in British, but I think also in Japanese psychology. Here from my hometown, Bradford in the north of England, we find some of the very early work from the 1920s from Henry Binns, published in the British Journal of Psychology. He really a practical man, interested in the assessment of quality in the woolen tops in the mills, and in the role of expertise in the perception of material quality. Should the expert going around these woolen mills rely on the evidence before their hand? Could quality be assessed purely visually, or would a multisensory judgment be more accurate than the best of the individual senses? This kind of 80 years before the Bayesian account of multisensory perception came online. And thinking also in this early work, sort of mentioning sort of the way in which you interrogate materials, whether it's active or passive, and very much in the case of fabric perception, this kind of scrunch between the finger and thumb as being what feels like it gives us the best estimate of what is out there. And so, in research funded by Unilever, interested in material perception of fabrics, and in particular how fabric perception would change before versus after being in the washing machine, we've done a lot of research on using sound and smell and touch to kind of augment or modify the consumer perception. Tricky a matter to undertake, given that we don't really have the same kind of haptic rendering that we have for visual material qualities as yet. And in our hands involved a lot of engineering. We had to build, or the engineers had to build for us this aeroplane engine to rotate swatches of fabric you can see here in one box. And the subject would be able to see a swatch of fabric. But there were actually two of these wheels, one above the other, so our participants could see one swatch of fabric from the mirror here, but they would stick their hand in the box below and actually feel perhaps the same or perhaps a different swatch of fabric. And in this case, they'd be able to engage with that material in a naturalistic manner, as so. They would the material they saw and felt would be in the same spatial location, and it could move at the same time. So all the cues that the brain might need to believe that what it was seeing was the same material as it was feeling. And in this case, we were varying the quality of the material in terms of pilling. So a kind of roughness, a naturalistic measure of roughness of a material. And here we have a slightly less pilled sample above and a slightly more pilled material sample below. Pilling generally a bad sign in material perception. What we found in a series of studies when we presented different textures to eye and hand is that at least for very fine surface textures, it was your tactile impression of pilling that tended to dominate over discrepant visual inputs to give you a multisensory experience. As the surface texture went from sort of microgeometric to a macrogeometric texture, then we saw the dominance flip, and suddenly what you saw dominated the total multisensory experience instead. Hence hinting at the kind of difficulties that there's no fixed mapping or dominance between seen quality and felt, but here depending a little on the scale. I had a few papers on that nature of the interaction. We were also interested at the time to see whether you could have a super additive experience of roughness or pilling in a fabric, that if it looked like there was a little bit of texture and it felt like there was a little bit of texture, would the multisensory percept be of an incredibly textured material? But that we were unable to determine. And one could use this sort of approach, categorizing which sense dominates for different multisensory textures, in order then perhaps to create congruent combinations. And this perhaps what we see from the promotional materials from British American Tobacco, I think, or Philip Morris. Their business is tobacco, so their brochure should perhaps look like a sheet of tobacco, and here, a little hard to see, but the surface was rendered to give the sort of perfect feel of a sheet of tobacco. So visual, tactile congruency as the outcome. But what I'm always struck by is how incongruency between our quality judgments for different senses can actually be more interesting, or at least more memorable to us. And for me, we haven't done any experiments on this, but my own first-person experience comes from this envelope, which was handed to diners at a Michelin-starred restaurant in England, the Fat Duck, with Chef Heston Blumenthal, detailing the courses you had in the meal. And the envelope itself is just placed there in the table midway through the meal. And it looks like a regular vellum envelope, but I still, more than a decade later, remember picking that envelope up and going, wow, it felt totally unlike what it looks like. It felt just like human skin, something you would never expect on the outside of an envelope. So here, this incongruency, this sort of hidden incongruency, in the words of Rick Schifferstein from Delft, would be something that really captures your attention and, in the right context, can give you an impression of the quality of this thing that might not be predicted by always driving towards the senses coming into alignment. But I think sound too is important, and that's an area where we've probably spent more of our time thinking about the sound of material qualities, inspired by work on the parchment skin illusion, where you have people rubbing their hands together in front of a microphone and play the sounds back, preferably in time. And we ask subjects to think about the feel of their skin, how moist or dry, clammy or wet it feels, and then simply change the sound of that interaction. And people in an instant suddenly feel like their own skin has changed its quality. It suddenly feels dry and parched, even though we've had decades of experience of what our skin looks like. Here, a sound can dominate and change tactile experience, even when you know that you are being tricked, and it occurs instantaneously. Of course, asking people about their own skin is a slightly strange question, in that we sort of know it can't literally change in real time. And for that reason, again, with Unilever, we've been working on the sound of materials, using setups like the one we see here. We have our subject with a finger in a box, feeling a wheel of different tactile materials, of different sandpaper grit levels. We have a microphone, headphones. You can see the setup here. 7 different pieces of sandpaper on the wheel, automatically rotated between trials, and our subjects trying to estimate the true roughness of this surface. Sometimes we play back the normal sound of the interaction, as we have here. Sometimes we might cut the high frequency components of that interaction. But then, if we do the parchment skin manipulation, it really feels like a different material. And if that's your finger being rubbed away on the surface of the paper, the illusion is sort of very powerful. And much like the McGurk effect, seems to be an automatic capture and modification. And to the extent that all of our interactions, all of our actions and contact with the world delivers some sort of auditory feedback, this may provide a powerful cue to changing material quality perception, but doing it through the ears rather than through the eyes. And it's something that the marketeers can then pick up on, either changing what actual products feel like, or here using the sonic properties to try and convey what these materials would feel like after they come out of the washing machine. And beyond that, we're going to take the idea of auditory material qualities and put it in an augmented reality situation. And this is work we've been doing with Halishan, a company based in London. We've got a slightly poor quality video here, but most augmented reality mirrors that are used in shops can superimpose a garment over the shopper's body, but it's a purely unisensory experience. And we worked together with Halician and Condiment Junkie to actually synchronize realistic material sounds in this augmented mirror experience, and by so doing, showing that customers engaged for longer with the augmented reality mirror, but also bringing in the multisensory and bringing in the sound led to an increased willingness to pay slightly for the item so virtually tried on. And then beyond that, thinking about the sound of material qualities, we've been working with a design school in Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, a town where most of the women wear high heels for reasons that aren't entirely clear. But the owners of the high heel and shoe stores are very interested in the experience of the material of those shoes by customers. And so in the design school, we had about 25 middle-aged ladies come into the lab and walk on a virtual catwalk where we changed, through sound, the material qualities of the heel of the shoe. And here we can vary both the material of the heel and the material of the floor on which that heel is walking, and synchronize it with our participants as they walk along their different material, floor, interaction, sound. So all our participants walked along the floor. We augmented the sound of the material of the heel, something that some designers do deliberately when they actually create shoes. Here we're doing it virtually, and we're able to show in this case that changing the material quality of that heel not only changed people's perception of the shoe, but also had an emotional consequence on themselves, that the louder the heel led to some changes in the emotional state. So this is how material perception might affect us as users. And I'll just leave the auditory bit here with this paper that came out, I think, yesterday or a couple of days ago from some German researchers, again thinking about the haptic experience of softness, I think, of fabrics, but this time showing that if you play soft music, so a sound that has no literal relation to the material itself, nevertheless, still you can increase perceptions of haptic softness through background music, just as we've been doing through manipulating product sounds. So again, making the notion of this sort of multisensory perception of quality one that resides not just in the sensory cues from the product, but also from the environment in which that product is assessed. And then finally, I want you to think about smell, because Unilever was mostly a sort of fabrics company thinking about laundry, detergents, washing powders. And could we augment softness as others had augmented brightness or whiteness of clothing simply by adding a white, or in our case, a soft smell, or a clean smell. And here we have our fabric carousels inverted, so you can naturally hold these swatches of toweling. We then deliver olfactory stimulation, which is task irrelevant. We only ask people about the feel of the material of those terry towel swatches. We create a computer display to run the whole thing, and then create a staircase of different feels depending on what we wash those terry toweling fabrics in. So people are making a real meaningful discrimination between the very smooth aminosilicon coated towels and the very rough and starchy towels at the other end of the spectrum. And what we can show is that by adding a pleasant as compared to an unpleasant scent, our participants rate the experience, the quality of softness of that fabric as higher with the sweet smell rather than with the bad animal smell or with no smell at all. So leading us to suggest that the material perception of softness is, again, more than just what you feel, more than just what you see or what you hear. It also involves an olfactory component, at least for those kind of things that we expect to have a smell. We followed up with on-street testing, just giving people in the streets of Oxford a single swatch of fabric with or without scent, and could show softness was again modified by what was going into our participants' nose. And this insight's then used within industry to try and think about how to improve the consumer's perception of the quality of their washing after it's come out, when it's gone from dry and dirty to wet, and yet can we convince people that your washing looks brighter, it looks cleaner, it feels softer, simply by using the other senses than just vision and touch. And it might also lead on to those who are now starting to deliberately fragrance their fabrics. Here, a Portuguese company who noted that many people don't like to wash their jeans because it sort of loses some of their quality, they think. So here we have it, fragrance impregnated into the jeans, and of course, if we are thinking about congruency, if they're yellow, they should have a lemon fruity scent to match, and I bet people's experience of that material, of its quality, is modified by the scent and its relation to the other properties. And finally here, what's true of fabric perception has also been shown by my colleagues at Givaudan, one of the fragrance houses, in terms of people's perception of shampoo and of their own hair, if they have any, as a result of the fragrance that is added to the shampoo. And here then you might think about the feel of softness, of cleanness, but also perhaps the glossiness or the shine of hair is important to many people, and which again can potentially be modified by fragrance, at least in these situations where we expect fragrance to go together with a particular material or object or action. Okay. And finally here, when thinking about the kind of the experience, the multisensory experience of fabrics, I guess one other reason to think that tactile exploration is more complex than it might at first seem is to realize that the skin surface has different distributions of receptors in the hairy skin versus in the palm of the hand, where we may normally evaluate a fabric between these fingers in the hairless skin, but then that fabric is touching us on a hairy part of the skin that has C tactile afferents in. And so again, in work funded by Unilever, we've been trying to track and assess how material quality is judged differently as a function of the skin site on which it is addressed or placed or stroked. And just one example here showing significant differences in the pleasantness of a material, tinfoil, as a function of whether it's on the hand or on the forearm. Another difference here for Oasis, the material you put in your flower pots, that to me is one of the most unpleasant materials ever. I hate the feel of it. It's not going to damage my skin, but maybe I'd like it a little bit more on my forearm, but not on my hand. So maybe there are individual differences here, as well as those body site related differences in the field of materials. Okay. So that's how I think all the senses can contribute to multisensory perception of quality of a material or a garment or a surface. Now flipping it around and thinking about how material quality affects multisensory perception of other items, this brings us into the world of food and drink. And here I've long been struck and used this example from Japanese product designer Naoto Fukusawa, from an exhibition that came to the architecture school in London probably 15 years ago now, of this ultra hyper-realistic product packaging. Too expensive for the supermarket, I suppose, but in principle at least, aren't you convinced without having to do the experiment that your kiwi juice would taste more kiwi-like, more natural, more fresh, more fruity if served in a container that has the perfect hairy rendering of a kiwi. The banana milkshake, my favorite, again, could be packaged in this hyper-realistic, sort of waxy, sheened banana packaging, and so it goes on. So this was 15 years ago, but hints at the possibility of how the material of packaging, the material qualities of the things that we use to eat and drink might affect our taste experience. And this idea that the material qualities of packaging, of plateware, of cutlery can affect us is one that has exploded, I think, in recent years. A number of innovative plateware manufacturers now coming out with beautiful receptacles like this. This one, I think from Poderosa, a European, Spanish company, served as a vessel for a cocktail in one of the most innovative world-leading cocktail bars. And you can already imagine what it might feel like to touch that drinking receptacle and how its lightness and its texture in the hand might modify your perception of the contents therein. There are many examples of this from art and design being put out there into the marketplace, and creatives of the kitchen and of the bar trying trial and error to see what happens when you serve things differently. We've been trying to inject a bit of sort of science to that process. In our hands, looking at the texture of plateware in a study with Lulu Biggs, one of my students from a couple of years ago, and showing that we could enhance people's perception of the texture, of the biscuitiness, of the pungency and gingeriness of a ginger biscuit simply by serving it from a plate that was roughly textured rather than a plate that was smooth in the hand. So here are the material qualities of the plateware impacting our experience of what is served in, on, or from it. Other colleagues in the Netherlands have come out with a sort of more macro-geometric textures and 3D printed cups. And again, they've been able to show that the drink served from this cup on the left will taste sweeter to you because of the roundness felt in the hands than if the same drink is served to the same person in a slightly more angular cup instead. And there are a growing number of examples of this kind of work out there now. This from a study with Fabiana Carvalho, who is a Brazilian barista and sensory analyst. And she's been going around the world, taking the latest in design, different colored cups, different shapes of coffee cups. And in this case, in a paper just came out last week in Food Quality and Preference, we had two different cups of different textures, one very smooth on the lips, the other one a commercially available but much rougher textured finish of the coffee cup. And we had professional coffee roasters, Q graders, baristas, rating the same coffees from the smooth or the rough cup. We also had regular consumers rating the coffee as we varied the properties of the cup. And what we were able to show is a significant difference in sort of mouthfeel characteristics as of the coffee as a function of the texture felt in the hands and or lips. You can do that also just with a piece of sandpaper. Next time you try some coffee at home, try rubbing a piece of sandpaper or a piece of silk, and the difference in the material properties there will likely change your experience of the coffee. What you're feeling in the hand is unrelated to what you're tasting, and yet nevertheless there's some similarity here. Somewhat the Italian futurists called syntactilismo, this relationship between tactile attributes and tastes that seems to draw our attention to something in the tasting experience through touch and through material, either seen and or felt and or heard. And that then leads into our current work. This on the one hand, together with 3D printing with a Polish manufacturers, creating new kinds of materials for the augmentation and almost the predictive enhancement of taste, sensation, using both color, but also you see there's kind of textures printed on the outside of this cup, designed to do something, hopefully pleasurable to the taste. It's not the coffee itself, but the material properties of what that coffee is served in clearly impact the experience. And finally, this example from a Japanese potter who works in the Midlands in the UK, Reiko Kaneko, and she took the latest findings around the importance and impact of color, texture, weight of plateware, and created these 3 plates that were launched at Euro Cucina in 2017, and are perhaps the first examples of, dare I say it, sort of neuroscience-inspired plateware design, where we have a very round and pink plate, the roundness and the pinkness designed to enhance sweetness in a dessert. We have the kind of sort of semantically sort of water-themed blue and white ripple plate for seafoods. And this is my favorite, and accompanies the abstract for the talk. this a plate designed to be held in the hands, so you feel the material properties of this bowl. It has gold finish. Underneath it has a really rough texture, like sandpaper. It feels unfinished, but that texture to be felt in the hand is designed to enhance the pungency of a Thai green curry, or the ginger in a Thai green curry. So it's sort of functional use of material properties to enhance the multisensory perception of taste. We have yet to evaluate these plates formally, but that they are out in the marketplace already, I think hints at some of the excitement around what you can do with a better understanding of multisensory material. And I'll leave off just thinking about not the plates, but the cutlery, and this sort of thing between sort of natural and artificial, and that while we might like the idea of natural, perhaps we don't always. And this from Merritt Oppenheim from 1930, the fur cup, very natural material. It's just something that most people don't like the idea of putting that fur to their lips. So natural, but unpleasant in this case. That idea of sort of natural materials being incorporated into plateware is one that we have, again, been working on with designers, with chefs, with silversmiths. And here we see one example of the furry bowl that was recently displayed at the Victoria and Albert Museum as one of the pieces of future plateware. This, my sort of favorite. Talk about, does material, is there really an olfactory to material qualities? I think so, yes. If you'd been at my house when we had a lab dinner party, and the chef who was working in the lab coated my wife's cutlery with hare skin, and then served the hare whose skin you were holding, then as you put your bowl into the stew of hare, you can sort of feel the animal, and the heat of your hand warms up the skin, and you start to smell the animal you're eating. It's a really sort of a very impressive experience, a multisensory experience, completely unlike your normal experience of cutlery. Natural, yes. Pleasant, probably not. But memorable, most certainly. And this is, again, sort of how the artists, I think, are taking some of the inspiration from the science materials and incorporating it, not always successfully, into experience. Now I'll just leave you up with about 3 or 4 minutes. Perfect. With some of the other thoughts on the natural and the cutlery. One might think of wood as a natural material, so appropriate for use in dining, as we try and move away from the artificial. But it's not always so easy to do. Here we see some sort of beautiful looking wooden cutlery served to diners in the world's top restaurant, Noma, for one of the courses. And yet, when you see what people say about eating food with that natural material, here we have my colleague, we were given wooden forks and spoons which were too light, and the texture in the mouth took away from the experience. A few of us had the same impression. Even a heavier wood would have improved the experience of the food. It was like eating with a spork from a takeaway. Natural, but too light, and the texture kind of doesn't match up. And here, I think the texture in mouth is something that's rarely considered. Mostly texture perception is thought about, researched in the external body, but there's a lot of it going on in the mouth too. Now, we took that sort of idea and ran with it to think about all the material properties of cutlery that we might modify and why we might do so. We've done, for example, work taking light versus heavy canteen cutlery and demonstrating that people in a restaurant rate food as tasting better if they have more weight in their hands. So heavier cutlery makes food taste better. And then we can combine that result with my wife's cutlery example, and you get this. Again, it's the artist, the creative of the kitchen, exploring what the material of cutlery might be like in the future. This from the final course of the Fat Duck restaurant, one of the world's top Michelin-starred restaurants near Oxford. And even just by looking at the spoon, you're already imagining how much effort you would have to put in to lift the spoon up. You can sort of predict the effort involved, but in this case you would be wrong because the weight has lead weight in the handle of the spoon so that whenever a diner picks this object up, it feels heavier than they expected, and heavier than we expect seems to be a sign of quality. We have the texture there too, and that texture has been embedded with heliotropin flour or Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. So it gives off a scent of relaxation, of sleep time, feels soft, but also feels quality. I don't think this will be on department stores or Christmas lists soon, but again shows how the chefs are playing here and questioning the material properties of our everyday utensils, something that has not really been looked at before. And finally here, I leave you with, is there a taste of material properties or material quality? Perhaps there is this, the seating from a London restaurant where we did a dinner, and you can see every diner has 7 spoons in front of them. And we did the laboratory psychophysical research with blindfolded participants tasting from 4 of these spoons, all identical in weight, in balance, and just coated with either silver, gold, zinc, or stainless steel. And we're able to show that the change in the material of the spoons significantly changed people's ratings of the taste of the food that they had from that spoon. So yes, there is perhaps a gustatory or taste element to cutlery, to material quality. And through to this, this is what is in the stores, and on the front cover of my book, in Japan at least, Gastrophysics, the wonderful kind of Studio William textured spoons. Why is smoothness, coldness, hardness such a good thing in the mouth, one of our more sensitive regions? And here we have 4 spoons created by intuition, but I think there are lots of experiments to do there to investigate how those different textures in the mouth change the taste. And I'll leave you just with a video. This from a recent collaboration with Glenmorangie Whiskey and with 4 video artists from France. And it's again using texture, but in a slightly different way here to modify the tasting experience. And in this case, the idea was to try and deliver a ASMR response, one of those kind of little neck shivers that many people get, kind of electric tingle, the autonomous sensory meridian response. Deliver it through a video at the same time as people were tasting. And for that, very often, if you look online at ASMR content, it's all about people whispering, and just gently folding paper and whispering behind your head. And so it's sort of a high pitch very often. But we interviewed many ASMRers, asked them about the sensory qualities that triggered their electric neck shivers, found that it was both high and low in pitch. It was close-ups. It involved texture in various forms. And those insights from the ASMRers were then incorporated into these 4 videos that were designed to match the taste and the texture of the whiskey tasting experience for the 3 or 4 expressions of Glenmorangie. And here's one of the videos that called Sense the Extraordinary that one of the artists came up with. And one can think about kind of the close-ups of the scenes, but also the use of auditory texture, of visual textures, sometimes matching, sometimes perhaps incongruent, high and low pitch, but linked in with sort of semantic themes of Scotland. And this has been their most successful digital marketing campaign ever, but I think for me at least sort of illustrates this interplay of texture and material quality, the Shitsukan, but one in which I would say involves far more than just the seen and or felt. The sound, the smells, and the tastes all have a potential role to play, at least sometimes. And in our own work, I think it's been very fruitful and enjoyable to go beyond what we could uncover from the science and what was possible from the technology, but then to put some of the insights in the hands of the artists, the creatives, the designers, and see how they take those insights in order to deliver new kinds of experience of material properties, both in the things themselves, but also in the way that those things, those objects, affect our experience of everything else. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
So how much of this is associative? In other words, I mean, you grow up expecting cutlery to fall in a certain sweet spot of weight, and if people had grown up with a different distribution of that weight to sensory experience, would it change all this?
Yeah, so I suspect many of these associations, one might call almost synesthetic, or we'd call sort of cross-modal correspondences, they may all be learnt. One does find some researchers, Stevens for one, suggesting maybe there are some innate correspondences that do not depend on the experience we have. So maybe the mapping of more intense sensations, so heavier weight going with more intense taste and fragrance is one that we may be hardwired for, he would say. But I'm happy to say that many of the others are learnt. And yet, and if you speak to, when we speak to chefs and cutlery makers, they'll sort of say, yeah, kind of intuitively I sort of knew that the weight of cutlery mattered. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you look in the science journals until 2011, you think everything we've ever eaten has been via chopsticks, knife, fork, or spoon. There's never been a scientific study. So it's all sort of intuition. And I think you can certainly go too far in terms of, there have been some restaurants that have put kilograms of cutlery on the table and had women in particular saying, I just can't lift it up, and it spoils the experience, so you can go too far.
It must have some tuning curve, if you will, in the neuroscience terminology.
And so very often it can be hard, so we find that round is sweet, and is that because of what you see in the marketplace, that most sweet products have round, curvy typeface? Also, we have been to Namibia, to the Himba tribe, who have no supermarkets, no written language of schooling, and when we give them some of the same tests, we find that they do not think that bitterness is angular and sweet is round. They think the opposite. So why that is, we do not know yet.
Yeah.
In that case, argues against
that's really, it's interesting, and make the other question you could think of is, can you habituate some of this so that it disappears, the expectation shifts?
And that would be one that we're sort of working on with a lot of the packaging manufacturers who would say, we're being told by government we have to reduce the weight of our packaging, but we know intuitively or through experimentation that in fact heavier packaging makes whatever it is seem better. So how can we resolve that? How can we either trick the mind of the consumer to make light things seem heavy, or how is there a way of training people to accept light as the new quality? Right. And there are a few examples where that works. I guess those are the examples of shifting people from full fat to low fat milk and reducing salt in cereals. But in many other cases, it feels like consumers reject, and it's hard to encourage them to go in the direction that you might want.
Thank you.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation. I'm sorry, this is not scientific or technical question, but from the aspect of social one. I think the pot introduced from the purple Polish one. You introduced the pot on the dot. It seems to me it's like a braille for blind people, Tenji. Mm-hmm. Can you introduce the contribution of your research to the handicapped people, something?
Mm-hmm. So we've primarily worked with sort of the healthy adults in this area so far. We are certainly working with the elderly, thinking about some of these strategies to enhance the perception of the food in those who have no teeth, who have no taste buds, and who have no hearing. So I know colleagues in Tsukuba, I think, here in Japan, have a sonic, they play back the sound of texture of food when you eat for those elderly who have only eat liquidized meals. So it is being used there. And we also seen that there's a startup in Canada who's now trying to make new coffee cups, and they're varying the shape, the text, the colour, but they're also embossing words onto the outside of the cup. So the idea, when you hold the handle of the cup, you will feel the word, which might be sweet or quality, and trying to communicate in that way, as well as through the abstract textures. But in terms of the Braille, there is thus far surprisingly little research on food perception amongst the blind or deaf. Just virtually, even amongst colourblind, you'd think if 12% of the male population are colourblind, surely it would be in somebody's interest to study that and how it affects food, and we can find nothing ever.
Okay, so thank you very much, Charles.